So in episode 3, we looked at the overview of Azure Stack HCI, and we briefly touched upon the two flavors of the Microsoft Azure Stack HCI, which is the Windows Server HCI and the Azure Stack HCI. So in this episode, probably we're going to take a deep dive into the two different flavors of the Microsoft HCI portfolio, which is the Windows Server and the Azure Stack HCI. Hello and welcome back, and thanks again for tuning into my YouTube channel, Jayant on Cloud. Please hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to get notified as and when I upload new videos. And my name is Jayant. I work as a Senior Principal Engineering Technologist at Dell Technologies. And in this episode, we're going to talk about probably the most misunderstood and the debated products under the Microsoft HCI umbrella, which is the Windows Server HCI and the Azure Stack HCI. So without wasting much time, let's dig right into it. So if you look at the two products, the Windows Server and the Azure Stack HCI, in case of Windows Server, it's been there, it's a legacy operating system, it's evolved over time. The latest and the greatest is the Windows Server 2022. The Azure Stack HCI is nothing new because it's still a stripped down version of the Windows Server, which is basically catered for the virtualization needs of the organizations today. So which means, remember in my previous episode where I talked about the Azure Stack HCI is an operating system which is delivered as an Azure service, which means it has very tight integration with Azure. So as you would expect, it comes with some of the cloud services that you can imagine. And both operating systems, if you look at the way they operate, Windows Server can operate in a connected or a disconnected approach. So which means, think about customers, maybe they're coming from a defense background or maybe a government organization which mandates that none of their clusters can actually get exposed to the internet. In such situations, probably the Windows Server best suits such organizations. In case of Azure Stack HCI, it has to be in a connected model only. So which means at least there has to be a connection to Azure at least once in 30 days. That's what Microsoft recommends. If you look at the hybrid use cases, which means on-premises and public Azure, Windows Server is probably is the less sought after compared to the Azure Stack HCI, because Azure Stack HCI is an operating system which is delivered as an Azure service. So it comes with a tight integration with Azure. So it brings that cloud operating model that you associate with the public cloud to on-premises using Azure Stack HCI. So, and if you look at the targeted use cases, right? Windows Server is typically for the best guest operating system. And with typical server roles that you would associate with, like the IaaS, the Active Directory, the DNS, DHCP, and so on. On the other hand, Azure Stack HCI is the best virtualization host because Azure Stack HCI is an operating system which gets deployed on the nodes which host the cluster. In terms of the licensing, Windows Server is still tied to the traditional, licensing that you would associate with, like the enterprise agreement or the volume-based licensing that usually that you associate with Microsoft in terms of the traditional Windows Server licensing. In case of Azure Stack HCI, it's tied to an Azure subscription, which means, if an Azure Stack HCI, like we saw in my previous episode, we had to register the Azure Stack HCI cluster against an Azure subscription and using the global admin credentials, which means it does require an Azure subscription to operate. In terms of support, you have the Windows Server traditional support, different enterprise support agreements and so on. In case of Azure Stack HCI, it's covered under the Azure support. It comes under the Azure umbrella of support. Windows Server, it can pretty much, you can deploy it on any hardware, right? Today, Windows Server can be deployed as a bare metal server as well, right? So it does deploy it on a standalone server, or it could be on a cluster of servers if you want to do an HCI. In case of Azure Stack HCI, it has to be deployed on a certified system only. So Microsoft has certified close to about 200 different platforms from various OEM hardware vendors, which is certified to work only on those systems. So if you look at the technical differences between the Windows Server and Azure Stack HCI, both of these products have a very, very rich roadmap and very robust roadmap and releases, no doubt about that. And also, they both of them take advantage of the latest and the greatest SDDC features like the Hyper-V, the software-defined storage, and the software-defined networking. And after that, it starts to differentiate. For instance, Azure Stack HCI comes with pre-built feature known as the stretch clustering to achieve disaster recovery, while Windows Server has to rely on traditional tooling or maybe third-party DR solutions. The Azure Stack HCI, on the other hand, supports the complete GUI-based deployment workflow, which we're going to show you in the next few episodes as to how you actually can deploy Azure Stack HCI cluster. It's as seamless as possible. So it's a GUI-driven deployment workflow. In terms of the full stack update with the OEM integration. So when you talk about the full stack, there are two pieces to it. One is the Windows updates, and then the hardware updates. In case of Windows updates, Microsoft releases like a monthly update and the quality updates and security updates, which can be monthly or quarterly. And they also have an yearly update, which is probably a full-blown update in terms of the newer version of the Azure Stack HCI OS. For example, the currently shipping version of the Azure Stack HCI OS, which was released in October 2021, is 21H2, and soon we are going to be expecting 22H2. Right now, 22H2 is under preview. So, in case of the hardware features, hardware updates, so OEMs like Dell, they keep releasing newer firmwares and the newer BIOS and driver updates every quarter. So even that has to be, updated for the entire cluster. So this is where the update lifecycle management wizard helps you to update not only the operating system update, but in a single workflow, you can also update the hardware updates, which includes the firmwares and the drivers and the BIOS in a single workflow fashion. So the cluster-aware OS features, right? So what is cluster-aware updating? Now, updating a cluster requires basically the orchestration between some updates that may require an operating system restart, and the service must be restarted one at a time. You can't just bring the whole cluster down, right? It has to be restarted one at a time to ensure the availability of the cluster. It's making sure that the applications are highly available. So the cluster-aware updating is a Microsoft's default cluster orchestrator, which allows updates to be performed either through an integrated update experience in Windows Admin Center, or you can do it manually using the PowerShell commands as well. So cluster-aware updating also has an update extensible framework where the OEM hardware partners like Dell, for instance, can take advantage of the SDKs that are developed jointly to also enable the updating of the firmware, the BIOS, and the drivers. Because remember, even to update the firmware and BIOS in particular requires a server to be rebooted. So, with the SDKs that is available, which is from Microsoft, the cluster-aware updating SDK, you can actually do this in a true cluster-aware fashion without affecting the workloads that are running. So, which means you can reboot one node at a time, rebalance the workload, identify the next node, and evacuate the node, and so on and so forth, completely programmatically and in a true cluster-aware fashion. The other feature is manage the ability to manage multiple cluster in Azure portal. So as you would expect, Azure Stack HCI has very tight integration with Azure. So every cluster that you create using Azure Stack HCI needs to be registered with an Azure subscription. So the moment you registered, it shows up under Azure Stack HCI as a resource. So you can tie any Azure construct to it, so it would treat that as a first-class Azure resource. So dynamic CPU compatibility mode. So this is made available in 21H2, which is for the Azure Stack HCI only. So which means you can mix and match different generations of processor. For example, you have a Skylake processor, and the latest right now we have is Ice Lake processor. So you can actually mix and match the two generations of processor together to take advantage. For example, if you have workloads that want to take advantage of the latest, vector calculations, that the CPU manufacturers would release, probably to speed up the vector calculation. So the applications can take advantage of the newer capabilities of the newer CPUs, and also you can pretty much do a live migration between the different generations of the CPU. All the clustered VMs can do live migration between those nodes. But just keep in mind that live migration today is not supported with a different CPU manufacturer. For example, if you have an Intel CPU and then an AMD CPU, the live migration is not supported. It has to be rebooted. The VMs have to be restarted from into a different CPU vendor. So that is not supported today. GPU high availability with pooling. Now, GPU today is supported using a discrete device assignment, which is called DDA, which is also known as pass-through, which means every VM that wants to take advantage of GPU capabilities is manually assigned with the GPU card. So with the GPU pooling, which is available with Azure Stack HCI, you can actually migrate virtual machine from one host to the other, as long as you can't mix and match different GPU generations. It has to be the GPU cards. It has to have a same GPU card within the cluster pool. But what you can do is you can actually migrate a VM from one host to the other if there is a shortage of resources and so on. Remember, right now, live migration of GPU VMs are not supported, so it has to be an offline migration, which means it has to restart from a different node. The other feature is 10 times faster reboot using kernel soft reset. So with 21H2, Microsoft introduced the kernel soft reboot feature, which means you can actually reboot the Azure Stack HCI operating system that much more faster compared to what traditional, let's say, for instance, a Windows Server would do. So when Microsoft did the comparison between the Azure Stack HCI deployed with 21H2 versus the Azure Stack HCI deployed with 20H2, which did not have the kernel soft reboot feature, kernel soft 21H2 just required 20 minutes to reboot versus 20H2, which took about 4 minutes on a Dell PowerEdge 8740 XT. So you can see the difference between the amount of time that it took, right? For example, right? So not every server has to really go through the post sequence. For example, especially when there is no need for for example, BIOS update, right? Which does not have to really go through a post sequence. In such cases, you can just do a kernel soft reboot, which means it's just rebooted in just less than 10 seconds to take advantage of the faster reboots. So network ATC. So network ATC is a feature where deployment and operations of Azure Stack HCI and networking sometimes can be very complex and can be error-prone process, because today, as you can imagine, Azure Stack HCI configuration supports a lot of flexibility in terms of flexibility in terms of configuration of the host networking. So there are many moving parts that can be easily misconfigured or can be overlooked. So staying up to date with the latest and the best practices is also a huge challenge. And improvements are obviously made continuously as newer and the latest and the greatest technology is taken to shape. So additionally, configuration consistency is very key across the entire HCI cluster ecosystem. So with network ATC, you can reduce the host networking deployment time, complexity, and errors. It will also help you to deploy the latest Microsoft and validated support best practices. And you can also help configuration consistency across the entire clusters, which eliminates the configuration drift. As recently, Microsoft, we also started supporting the single node clusters with S2D. So imagine for all those remote and branch office locations or even in edge locations which just require a single node, you can deploy Azure Stack HCI cluster on that single node, and it's supported only with Azure Stack HCI and not on Windows Server. So thin provision volumes is again only supported only on Azure Stack HCI OS and not on Windows Server. So these are some of the technical differences that you can think of between the Windows Server and the Azure Stack HCI operating system. All right, so let's look at some of the workloads and the benefits between the Windows Server and the Azure Stack HCI. Now, AKS, which is the Azure Kubernetes Service, and the PaaS services which are built on top of AKS are still available for both versions of the operating system, which is Windows Server and Azure Stack HCI. For example, if customers want to make use of containerizing some of their traditional applications, like modernizing into containers, they can use AKS on both Windows Server and as well as Azure Stack HCI. Or if customers are interested to bring some of the Azure PaaS services, for example, Org enabled data services like SQL managed instances or Postgres Hyperscale, which is right now in public preview. By the way, SQL MI is already generally available. Or some of the other PaaS services like Azure App Services, such as Azure PaaS services such as Azure App Service, then Azure Functions, Logic Apps, and so on and so forth. So they can still target those using AKS onto Azure Stack HCI. Now the Windows Server 2022 Azure Edition. So what is Windows Server 2022 Azure Edition? So the Windows Server 2022 Azure Edition is a purpose-built OS specifically meant for public Azure. Now that's been made available now on Azure Stack HCI. So what are some of the benefits of the Windows Server 2022 Azure Edition? So with this, you customers will be able to do hot patching, which means without requiring a reboot. It supports SMB over QUIC. QUIC is the transfer protocol which was developed by Google in 2012. Then also extend network for Azure. So this is a feature which helps customers to stretch their on-premises subnet into Azure to let the on-premises virtual machines retain their original on-premises private IP addresses when migrating to public Azure, right? So some of these features are exclusively available only for the Windows Server 2022 Azure Edition. Now the Windows Server subscription add-on. Now Windows Server subscription add-on is now so customers always had the ability to bring their own licenses and activate them on Azure Stack HCI. So with now they have two options to activate their activate their Windows workloads. One, using the BYOL approach, which is bring your own licenses, they can use automatic virtual machine activation wizard within the Windows Admin Center and key in the product key, the activation key, and that way it automatically gets activated. So which means as and when they spin up a newer Windows workloads, they're automatically activated. The other option that customers have outside of BYOL is to basically purchase the Windows Server subscription right from Azure. So what happens is when they go, they have to basically they can do this right from the Windows Admin Center, or they can go into the Azure Stack HCI resource in public Azure using Azure Arc, and then buy their subscription-based Windows Server licenses directly. So when this is automatically activated, so as and when there's a Windows Server workload that spins up on Azure Stack HCI, it actually collects the product keys right from Azure, because it's tied to a subscription, and automatically activated. The other important thing, right, one of the huge benefits today, considering that many customers today are still, some of them that I talked to are still on Windows Server 2008 and SQL Server 2008, but majority of them are still on Windows Server 2012 and SQL Server 2012. Now, Windows Server and SQL Server 2008 and 2008 R2 is already end of support, right? So if you lift and shift these workloads onto Azure Stack HCI, you get the same Azure benefit, right? So which means you get the free extended security updates. Now this has been extended by one more year, so which means the Windows Server 2008 R2 is now going to be completely end of support after you lift and shift them to Azure Stack HCI. That is January 14, 2024, and SQL Server 2008 will actually go end of support in July 12, 2023, right? Remember, they were already end of support, but Microsoft has extended them so that you can make use of one additional year. Now, for SQL Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012, SQL Server is going to be officially end of support on July 12th, 2022, so which is going to be very shortly from now. So which means you can lift and shift the 2012 workloads after it becomes end of support, or even before it becomes end of support, and get that free 3 years of free extended security updates. And this holds true even for the Windows Server 2012 R2 and 2012 as well. So which means it's going to go end of support as on October 10th, 2023. So again, these are some of the great benefits that you actually get by adopting the Azure Stack HCI OS to modernize your on-premises infrastructure versus maybe a Windows Server. Okay, so let's look at some of the management options that are available for both Windows Server and Azure Stack HCI. Some of the management options that are already available, for example, the de facto tool for managing the HCI, Microsoft HCI clusters is Windows Admin Center. So using Windows Admin Center or the legacy Microsoft System Center suite of products, you can still manage both Windows Server and Azure Stack HCI clusters. The other Azure features that are available, for example, Azure Backup or Azure Site Recovery. Now, these features are still made available for both Windows Server as well as Azure Stack HCI. Now, as we discussed in my previous episode, when I showed you, Azure Stack HCI has to be registered against an Azure subscription, and also Azure Stack HCI is one of the resources in public Azure. So, needless to say that it has a very, very tight integration with the Azure portal. In case of the Windows Server, you have to manually deploy the Arc agents on each of the nodes so that the cluster shows up in public Azure, and you can manage that cluster. So there's a manual effort there. So cluster integrates with ARM. ARM is actually Azure Resource Manager, using which you can manage any resource, truly implementing something known as infrastructure as a code, which means you can programmatically manage all of your resources right from an Azure control plane perspective. So again, needless to say, Azure Stack HCI is an operating system that is delivered as an Azure service. So it has a very tight integration with ARM, which means it gives you the Azure constructs natively, so that you can manage all of your resources deployed on Azure Stack HCI right from Azure portal. And in case of Windows Server, it does not integrate with ARM at all. So some of the extensions in Azure Arc enabled service. So we saw a number of extensions for Arc enabled servers, right? So that is by default made available on Azure Stack HCI, whereas in case of Windows Server, it needs to be manually deployed. Okay. Multi-cluster monitoring using Azure Monitor. So this is a feature that was announced in 2021 Ignite. Which means you get the ability to manage and all of your Azure Stack HCI cluster using Azure Monitor, right? So you get the Azure constructs of the Azure Monitor, and using which you can manage all of your Azure Stack HCI clusters deployed in different locations. So obviously you cannot do that with Windows Server. The one that is also in public preview, very recently announced, which is the Windows Admin Center for public Azure. So think about it, right? So you can just log into public Azure. You don't even have to go launch your console on premises. You don't have to launch the Windows Admin Center console on-prem. Instead, you can launch a Windows Admin Center console right from an Azure control plane, right? It's so powerful. I mean, it's already been a very, very rich feature set in terms of being able to manage your on-premises Azure Stack HCI clusters right from Azure portal. But in addition to that, Microsoft is also providing the Windows Admin Center, deeply integrated well within the Microsoft Azure portal. That's in public preview, by the way. And Arc-enabled VM management options. So this is basically the ability to deploy or self-provision a virtual machine right from Azure portal, which means you can spin up a virtual machine on Azure Stack HCI clusters right from public Azure. So again, this is only available on Azure Stack HCI and right now in public preview, but it's not available on the Windows Server. So these are really some of the powerful management capabilities that you see can make use of, and makes a tremendous value for customers adopting Azure Stack HCI clusters. Alright, so now coming to the last slide, but an important slide with respect to pricing options that are available for Windows Server and Azure Stack HCI. So if you look at Windows Server, it's a one-time licenses, which means you can just buy a one-time licensing from the Windows Server. Could be an enterprise agreement or volume-based. Whereas Azure Stack HCI is a pay-as-you-go kind of a service, which means there is a monthly subscription cost associated with it, which is right now at $10 per core per month. So Azure Stack HCI is pay-as-you-go, whereas Windows Server is a one-time licensing type. Price structure, it's usually per core. In case of Windows Server, again, one time. In case of Azure Stack HCI, it's per core per month. Like I said, it's US $10 per core per month. In case of evaluation period between the two, so Windows Server, as we all know, you can just download the Windows Server evaluation copy from Microsoft website, and you can use it for 180 days, which is close to 6 months. Then Azure Stack HCI is available only for 60 days, so just keep that in mind. So after 60 days, it'll start billing against the Azure subscription. And obviously the different channels that you can buy from. Windows Server is available through enterprise agreement licenses that you have with Microsoft, or volume-based licensing, or you can directly buy the OEM version of the Windows Server directly from any of the hardware partners, like for instance Dell, or you can use the SPLA licensing as well. So these are some of the options that are available with the Windows Server. In case of Azure Stack HCI, it could be enterprise agreement licenses, because enterprise agreement you can still buy your Azure subscription, or it can be through a CSP, which is a cloud solution provider, or you can directly buy an Azure subscription from Microsoft. So these are some of the pricing options that are available between Windows Server and Azure Stack HCI. But from the look of it, if you look at it, Azure Stack HCI may turn out to be, or does look probably a more expensive proposition on paper. That's absolutely right. But if you look at some of the benefits that we talked about, the management capabilities, the ability to lift and shift your legacy end of service workloads, Windows workloads onto Azure Stack HCI, to take advantage of 3 years of free extension that's available. So the powerful management capabilities that are available right from Azure Control Plane, the ability to provision a VM, or for instance, the hardware OEM integrated options that are tightly integrated into the Azure Stack HCI versus the Windows Server. This is not only just going to save customers a lot of time and effort, but it's also going to save them a lot of cost, down the line. No doubt, Windows Azure Stack HCI may work out to be a little more expensive on paper to begin with, but if you really look at some of the advantages that Azure Stack HCI drives home, I think it definitely overweighs or justifies the additional cost that you actually pay for Azure Stack HCI. And not only that, I think you as a customer is going to be at a far more in an advantageous position adopting Azure Stack HCI as a strategic initiative versus a Windows Server. Okay, so I know this has been the most sought after topic. Especially many customers that I talk to have these questions about, hey, what is the difference between Windows Server and Azure Stack HCI? I thought I should definitely do some homework and get this onto my channel. Hence this, I had this idea of getting this differentiation as a separate episode on Giant on Cloud. I hope you really liked it. Alright, so with that, I've come to the end of this episode. So in this episode, just to summarize, we went through the differences between the Windows Server and the Azure Stack HCI in terms of use cases and positioning. We also looked at some of the technical differences between the Windows Server and Azure Stack HCI. And also, what are the different types of workloads and the benefits that you get on Azure Stack HCI, and some of those benefits were not actually available on Windows Server. And we also looked at finally the various management options that are available between the two. And last but not the least, we also looked at the pricing options that are available between Windows Server and Azure Stack HCI. Please leave your valuable feedbacks, critiques, and suggestions in the comment section. Until then, stay tuned and stay safe.